The United States was, quite famously, a major supplier of medium bombers to their allies during the Second World War. Aircraft like the Douglas A-20 Havoc, also known as the Boston, the B-25 Mitchell, and the B-26 Marauder were built in such vast numbers that they not only served as mainstays for the United States Army Air Force, the USAAF, but also for most of the Allied air forces as well. Indeed, for the British, with their factories absolutely at the limit of what they could produce, it essentially became policy that aircraft production focus on heavy bombers and fighters, with medium bombers basically being sourced from the American Lend-Lease program. But while the aforementioned types are generally remembered because of their service with American units, practically forgotten is one aircraft that saw huge amounts of combat usage but it isn't so well recalled because that service was in the hands of other countries. The Martin Baltimore. And what is surprising is that this aircraft would be built in greater numbers by Martin than any of their other bombers except the B 26. The roots of the Baltimore go back to the aircraft building boom that American manufacturers enjoyed at the start of the war. France ordered from Martin several hundred of their Model 167s, which would also serve with British forces as the Maryland after France fell. But despite its eventual successes, the Model 167 was initially thought to be a comparatively limited design even before it got a chance to get into action, a factor that led to it being turned down for service by the United States Army Air Corps in 1939. However, Martin was convinced that they had a good basic concept and so began to develop an improved version, the Model 187, for future potential orders from European nations. In fact, the whole project originated from requirements set by the British. The French had paid for a major expansion in Martin's factory in Maryland to boost production and speed delivery to the French Air Force of the comparatively large numbers of Model 167s that they started placing orders for in January 1939. But when Britain and France started conducting close cooperation on coordinating their orders of American aircraft, the British expressed concerns that the frontline life of the 167s would be short-lived and as a result didn't initially want to purchase any for their own use. Instead, they proposed that an improved model be created, the 187. This took elements from the 167, such as the wings and cabin layout, but expanded the whole thing, giving it a longer and much deeper fuselage so as to carry bigger bombs, more powerful Wright R2600 radial engines that generated over 1,600 horsepower each to improve performance, and eventually powered gun turrets. This all allowed the new aircraft to be broadly comparable to the new North American B-25 and Douglas A-20s, which were to become the mainstays of the United States medium bomber squadrons in the first years of the war. Though the 187 didn't even exist yet, the new specification seems to have appealed to the Anglo-French Purchasing Commission, and they placed orders for 400 of the new bombers straight off the drawing board, assumably split between the two nations. However, the collapse of France the following month meant that the order was taken over wholesale by the British, along with all the other French orders. They subsequently renamed the aircraft as the Baltimore, a nod to the location of the Martin factory, or at least to the nearest major city to it. You would think that, based as it was on an existing and perfectly competent design, that the Baltimore's development would be fairly straightforward. But Martin, despite the expansion of their facilities, got bogged down with the massive work that began to pile up on them as more and more aircraft of different types began to be ordered in quantity by the United States in addition to their foreign orders. The timescale got pushed further and further back, and that almost killed the Baltimore before it flew. In November 1940, the British, inspecting the Martin factory to check on progress of their outstanding orders, including the Baltimores, caught sight of the new B-26 prototype and made it plain that they really wanted to have that aircraft instead. This actually got some approval from US officials who thought it made sense for Martin to cut down on their portfolio to help with their commitment issues. But Martin were now deeply committed to building the Baltimore and successfully argued that it was too late to stop development without substantial wastage of already made parts and tooling for the contract. Despite this, it would still be many months before the Baltimore would finally take to the air, with first flight occurring in June 1941. The delays meant that the aircraft wouldn't start to get into British and Commonwealth service until early 1942. As the British had a policy of sending American designs to overseas stations, the initial idea was that many of the Baltimores would go to Singapore and the Far East. But the Japanese entry into the war and the loss of the British colonies and territories in the Pacific meant that instead they were largely sent to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Here they would equip many squadrons of the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the South African Air Force, entering service just in time for Rommel's Spring Offensive, which saw the Baltimores thrown headlong into the fight to stem the Afrika Korps' drive into Egypt. Here they were found to have some issues and suffered heavily. The first 50, designated as the Baltimore Ones, were lightly armed, retaining the previous Maryland bombers layout of 4 rifle-caliber machine guns in the wings, and with a defensive armament limited to single Browning machine guns in both dorsal and ventral positions. They also had the unusual expedient of having 4 rearward firing machine guns, which apparently were to serve the purpose of scaring off pursuing enemy fighters. The armament was slightly improved in the second model, the 2, which fitted the dorsal position with twin machine guns and of which 100 were built. But the first combat missions proved problematic when the guns proved liable to freezing up, leading to a number of losses to German fighters. This led to the survivors rapidly having their dorsal armament changed to, depending on the source, either British licence-built Browning 303s or Vickers K guns. In fact, the British had already stipulated a significant improvement in the Baltimore's defensive armament, even before they took first delivery, and the final 250 of the initial order, designated as the Baltimore 3, were fitted with a hydraulically powered bolt-and-pull turret fitted with 4 303 Browning machine guns. This no doubt helped, but truth be told, most of the losses suffered in those early operations were both due to the tempo and in the way the Baltimores operated, at very low level in ground attack missions, often on important logistic points or troop concentrations. In other words, targets that were well protected. In fact, it was the same old lesson on the vulnerability of operating bombers at low level in the face of comprehensive anti-aircraft fire and without adequate fighter cover. The same risk factors that had inflicted heavy casualties on ferry battles in 1940 and on Bristol Blenheims in 1941 were now shown to still be true with Baltimore's in 1942, and again be shown by the bruising treatment later B-26s would get operating in this fashion in late 1942, early 1943. But despite their initial problems, the Baltimores were generally very popular. The narrow fuselage meant that movement for the 4-man crew around the aircraft was largely impossible and made for cramped missions, a feature carried over from the Maryland and which was a principal criticism of the type. Plus, the Baltimore was, if anything, overpowered for its size and weight, and had a tendency to ground loop violently if the pilot did not advance the throttles in complete harmony on takeoff. But there was no denying that the Baltimore was vastly superior to the principal British type it replaced, the Bristol Blenheim. In July and August of 1942, tactics were changed by the Desert Air Force so that the Baltimores flew at higher altitudes to be beyond the range of light flak units, as well as with fighter-bomber escorts. In fact, this led to a new methodology where a group of 18 Baltimores would carpet bomb the target, after which their bomb-carrying escorts would swoop down and perform precision attacks while the anti-aircraft gunners were still in their dugouts and not manning their guns. Though this all meant that losses were reduced somewhat, the Baltimores were heavily committed by this point, and as the British were ready to launch their riposte to the Axis advance with the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October, the Baltimores were one of the Imperial Force's principal bomber types in the pre-attack softening up raids. The fighting was ferocious. To quote one report by No. 55 Squadron Royal Air Force, which attacked a petrol depot at El Daba in Egypt with 12 Baltimores at an altitude of 9,000 feet on the 6th of October, 3 of the 12 aircraft were shot down and all of the others were holed repeatedly by intense and accurate flak. One of the crippled Baltimores crash-landed on an enemy minefield and all of the crew killed. The second crew bailed out, but one parachute failed to open. The third crew, except the pilot, also bailed out and became prisoners of war. The pilot, on only his third mission, found it impossible to open his escape hatch because of flak damage, so he attempted to glide back to our lines. He didn't quite make it, crash landing about 1,000 yards short in no man's land under heavy enemy fire. He was rescued eventually by two South African armoured cars under cover of a smokescreen. The remaining 9 aircraft, all damaged, got back to base, one having to belly land because of damage to the undercarriage. Our aircraft had 28 flak holes in it. This is just one example of the level of action that was fairly typical for Baltimore crews, not just at that time, but throughout the aircraft's career. With the passing of the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, the next batches of Baltimores built meant that the aircraft were technically owned by the United States, and so the type received the USAAF designation of A-30 for legal purposes. These were composed of 575 Baltimore 3As and 4s, which had a number of equipment differences, but the most notable one was the switching of the dorsal turret once again for a Martin electrically driven low-profile turret that housed two Browning 50 caliber heavy machine guns. The final order was for an additional 600 Baltimore 5s, which switched out the wing guns for Browning 50 cals and fitted more powerful Wright engines that produced 1,700 horsepower each. Additionally, it seems that the different operating methods led to the opinion that the ventral guns were largely irrelevant, and so they don't seem to have been fitted and the crew reduced to 3. The increasing numbers of Baltimores available, as well as additional supplies of aircraft like the Douglas Boston, B-25 and Martin B-26, meant that other nations' squadrons received them as well. On top of the 10 RAF, 3 SAAF and 2 RAAF squadrons that operated the type, it was used by 1 Greek, 1 Free French and 2 Italian Co-Belligerent Air Force squadrons, with another 70 or so supplied to Turkey as part of efforts to sway them to join the Allies, and where they served until 1950. But their service with Commonwealth units was far from over, and Baltimore's continued to operate on attack missions throughout the rest of the war, despite the increasing numbers of more modern and capable aircraft becoming available. After North Africa, they fought in Italy and over Yugoslavia, assisting Tito's partisan forces, as well as pounding German forces in Crete and throughout the Mediterranean. Some were sent to the fleet's air arm, where they operated with some success, being credited with sinking 8 U-boats. Indeed, consideration was given to building a specialist maritime patrol and attack variant, the Baltimore 6, but this was cancelled. The end of the war largely meant the end of the Baltimores. With copious numbers of both later American and British designs available, the type was very much redundant. A squadron continued to operate the type in Kenya on mapping and pest control duties until 1948, possibly 49, and in fact the Baltimore saw a tiny amount of use with the US Navy in 1946, when a single example was used to test airflow on diving aircraft, which saw that particular Baltimore achieve the rather worrying speed of Mach 0.82. But even these examples were soon sent to the scrapyard, and of the 1,575 Baltimores built, not a single example was saved. Considering their extensive combat records and the losses they took fighting some of the fiercest campaigns the Western Allies undertook, this seems a real shame. A real battler, respected by its crews, and in the very thick of it from 1942 until 1945. The Baltimore truly is a classic forgotten aircraft.